Thank you for having me. This is a pleasure. The title of my talk is Speeding Up Computations. And I hope that the meaning of the title will come clear midway through the slides. This is the outline for what I'm thinking of talking. I think we can make it in around half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we have time for questions. But if at some point I'm running out of time, I'm just going to skip half of the things that I wanted to say, and we can try to focus on discussions. So I'm going to give you some of my context because I think that is important to have in talks in general so that people know where we come from and how we made it to where we are. And then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about dimensionality reduction, the two steps that I see that we want to take to make that happen, the new way that I want to move from on doing this, and some thoughts that I want to share on you on pipelines, on how to build these reduced order models or emulators. And then I will close with some takeaways. I have two disclaimers that are very important for this talk. The first one is on content. You're going to see a lot of stuff. I have probably 110 slides. No way that you can process all that information in just 40 minutes that I will be talking. So I'm putting the QR code for the link to the slides. I will make that available later, and I will send the link later for the Google Drive. So the idea is for you to be able to, if what I said spark interest, to later go on the slides, check on details. You can send me an email, you can ask other people, etc. So just don't worry if I'm talking about too many things and you're not catching 100% all of them. The resources will remain. And the second disclaimer is on teamwork. You're going to see a lot of results, and this is not just me doing all of these things. This is a lot of people that I'm even missing a lot of folks to put in the slide in here. So it's a huge group that makes it possible to go through all of these applications and results. So my context, this is me and my dog, Dirac. I am the one on the right. And I was born in Latin America, in Caracas, Venezuela. And I did my undergrad in there, in Universidad Simón Bolívar. I was interested in astronomy because of the Cosmos videos by Carl Sagan. But then I got interested in everything. And I moved to Florida State to do my PhD. And I just wanted to work with the nicest person that I could find there. And that was Jorge Picarovich. He was working on machine learning and statistics applied to nuclear physics. That's why I became somebody that does that. And then I moved here to Michigan State to do a postdoc. And that is me carrying hay for sheep, which is part of the experience that I had, the whole experience that I had here in Michigan as a postdoc. And now I am an academic staff at FRIP, and I spend my time doing research in machine learning and Bayesian statistics applied to nuclear physics. But I spend a lot of my time as well on education, outreach, and community building efforts. And here are some resources on the things that I am making. I have videos of professors sharing their path and challenges. I have made a coming up to speed course for the incoming grad students where we discuss many important topics for grad school. And I also have materials on how to give talks, for example. So if you're seeing my talk, it's the first time that you see me present and you really like it, I have an entire video explaining the key concepts on how to make it in this way. And I work at FRIP, and at FRIP, we are trying to answer big questions about everything, about many things, from structure to astrophysics, to what's up with neutrinos, to how we can make all of this into something useful. And an important thing is that we do this while having fun. So these are pictures of us enjoying the research, but enjoying the community part as well. And that includes a teaser for a movie that is about FRIP that I don't think is publicly released yet, but soon, I hope. And that is a video of me playing the piano. We have a grand piano, and that is one of the things that I like to do in the afternoons after a day of research. So in FRIP, and this connects to many other places as well, we have a scientific cycle in where we have many interests. For example, astrophysics, structure, symmetries, as I mentioned. If you focus on even astrophysics, you say, oh, I want to study the R process, the rapid neutron capture process for nucleosynthesis, to know how these things were made. You need a lot of data for that, masses, capture rates, lifetimes. Even if you limit yourself to masses, you have many models, theoretical models that help you create that data. And if you run your calculations on that, I am sure that many of you have played with these ideas already, you end up having descriptions of reality that are different. So you need to connect them in some way. And then you have to create an experimental schedule on what you're going to measure next, such that you can improve those theoretical models. And you have to find a way of connecting all of those with observations from astronomy, like gravitational waves and neutron star radii. And all of this is a lot, and it's a cycle in where all of these things inform each other. And to make that happen, of course, we need teams of experts like you folks that have gathered together to form multidisciplinary collaborations such that you can inform this entire cycle from all of those points of view. But I will argue that we also need complementary models in every stage with well-quantified uncertainties. And at the heart of that cycle, I see a lot of statistics and computational tools that we are trying to develop to make the wheel turning in a way that makes sense. And because we want to have models with well-quantified uncertainties, that creates the need for speed. And that is because if you want to do, for example, Bayesian statistics approaches, usually you have experimental data. I think you can see my mouse. You have experimental data in, let's say, a cross-section with some error bars, and you want to create a model, the red curve, that produces some sort of uncertainty band so that you can compare in a meaningful way with experiment. And the problem for that is that in the Bayesian framework, that requires a lot of evaluations of your model as a function of the parameters. I'm going to be calling for the rest of the talk alpha, the parameters of my model. So if you want to make this work, most models will take way too long to sample this thing millions of times. So what we try to do is to create this idea of emulator. Is kind of analogous to think of you have butter, and then you want to make something that is, I cannot believe it's not butter. So you want to replace your physical model by this mathematical framework that gives you a very approximate answer. It really tastes very similar to butter, but can run way faster. And you can emulate directly your physical model, or you can find clever ways of emulating your posterior distribution. I'm not going to be focused on that one too much, but I want to show you the big part of the spectrum of different techniques. By the way, all of these links, every time that you see something that looks with this color and this line is a link that you can click, and I have put resources there so that you can go and explore. There are many things that you can do to emulate or reduce the dimensions of these things, and that is what I'm going to be focused on today in dimensionality reduction techniques, mostly focused on the physical models themselves. A group of friends and I have put together FRIP Theory Alliance Summer School in 2023, exactly to teach these things. And all the videos of the lectures are recorded. The materials are as well. It's in the YouTube channel, and we have a forum. You can join it and ask questions and start learning these things if you find them useful. Okay, so let's start talking about dimensionality reduction and the two steps that I see that we need to take for that. I recently recorded a video with my two best friends, Edgar Bonilla and Cal Godby, a 5-minute videos full of animations between the three of us explaining how we're using dimensionality reduction for research in nuclear physics. So if you fall asleep during my entire talk and then you only have a 5-minute spam period, I suggest that you check it out. We put a lot of effort, and I think it's very nice way to explain why we're doing what we're doing. If you haven't fallen asleep, then I'm going to explain it now step by step. These are the two steps that I see. You need to find good reduced coordinates for your system, and then you need to find equations that relates their dynamics as you change whatever properties you want to change. For example, if you were thinking about a brick, instead of modeling the dynamics of the brick by analyzing what happens to each one of the 10 to the 23 atoms that make the brick, you're a physicist, or many of you are physicists, you will say, I'm going to get away with 6 reduced coordinates, 3 translations, and 3 rotations. And with that, I should be fine to describe what is happening to the brick. There is physics that you're going to miss if you want to explain propagation of sound through the brick, or temperature changes on the brick, or how the brick breaks. These 6 coordinates will not be enough, but for most purposes, these 6 is more than enough to describe what is happening to your system. And then you need to give me equations on how these coordinates are going to change as you change, in this case, time. It's dynamical equations. Cool. So this works for the case of the brick. How do you do that when you have parameterized differential equations? There's many ways. I'm going to highlight one of them. So if you have, let's say, the Schrodinger equation, and you're changing the parameter of, let's say, a Wood-Saxon potential, the strength of the Wood-Saxon potential, and you're interested in scattering problems, like how neutrons scatter out of a nucleus, or how they're emitted once the nucleus fissions, or how they can be absorbed. You want to model those things in that way. So as you have your Schrodinger equation, one way of numerically solving this thing is to discretize your space in X and then use something like a shooting method, Runge-Kutta, or finite element method to obtain the solution. And in this case, the solution, I'm going to say that is a long list of the numerical values of the function evaluated at each one of these x's. So it's a long dimensional vector. You could think that this is indeed a long arrow in some very long dimensional space. Perhaps you discretize your space in 300 points. So this is a 300 dimensional arrow. Now, if instead of solving this for one parameter, you solve it for many parameters, you get this very pretty rainbow plot. And now you have a collection of vectors in that high dimensional space. And look at this very nice animation. You can transform those vectors, discrete vectors, into a continuum that is basically a parametrized curve that traces a trajectory in that long dimensional space. And that is what we're going to call the solution manifold for your model, is the continuum set of vectors that describe the solution to this equation as you vary the parameter, that in this case is only one parameter. The whole idea is, even though this dimension is very big, perhaps the dimension of the solution manifold is low dimensional. And I could find, for example, a plane to approximate, or a hypervolume that has a much smaller dimension of the original space to approximate that solution. So the idea is to say, can I characterize my long dimensional solution vector instead of many numbers in terms of two numbers? And in this case, these two will be the two direction of coordinates in these planes. And that's exactly what the reduced basis method does, is finding a linear embedding for the solution manifold. So you will come and you say, I'm going to approximate my function phi as a linear superposition of perhaps a function phi 0 that I don't change the coefficient, is kind of an offset of the whole thing, plus the linear superposition of these two reduced bases with some coefficients. How do you obtain these reduced bases? You can use data-driven methods, like you collect your solutions, your sample solutions in this rainbow plot. You make a principal component analysis or singular value decomposition algorithm, and then you obtain the two maximal directions of variability across this manifold, and those are the two reduced bases that you want. Now you need equations. How you're going to find how these coefficients change as a function of the parameters? Well, one way is to grab the Schrödinger equation that you have and just write it in this form such that it looks like an operator acting on phi equals 0. And then you project onto a subspace. And this projection is named, or it was developed mainly by a very cool dude named Boris Galerkin. And that's why it's called a Galerkin projection, or a Petrov-Galerkin projection by Petrov, somebody else that also contributed to the thing. So if you do this and you project your operator into a subspace, you end up with two coefficients and two equations, and you're good to go. You solve this system and you obtain the solution in the reduced space to the problem, the big problem that you had. I spent the last 3 days making this slide instead of making the rest of the presentation. So it's super busy, a lot of animations. We're going to be looking at it for the next minute or so. I want to guide you step by step on all the information that I'm showing in here. So if we focus on the left, you see the rainbow plot that I was talking about as I'm varying the Wood-Saxon potential of this scattering problem. And in black, the black line is the actual numerical solution that you get by using a traditional solver. In the dashed purple line is the approximation that you get by using the reduced basis and obtaining the coefficient in the way that I described. So you can see how the solution is moving in that rainbow plot as you change the value of the strength of the Wood-Saxon potential. Now, here below, I am saying phi, I can approximate it by this phi 0 term plus a coefficient that multiplies the first reduced basis, and the coefficient depends on the strength, plus a second coefficient that multiplies the second reduced basis. If you multiply this coefficient times the reduced basis, this is the behavior that you get as you're moving in this parameter, and the same on this one. It looks basically like normal modes. So you're basically finding the normal modes of your parametrized differential equation. The plot on the right is showing the solution manifold that we were talking, and is literally following in this imagined very high dimensional vector space that solution as you move the parameter. And finally, the plot on the bottom right shows you the coefficients A1 and A2 as a function of that parameter V. And this is very important because later in the talk, we're going to try to aim to learn this coefficient mapping in a way that is different from using the Galerkin projection. So all of this, I hope that it ties it together. As I said before, it's a lot of information. So you have the slides. You can go and stare at the animation later and we can have more in-depth discussions. How do you know if this thing will even work? How do you know if the solution manifold is linearly embeddable? Well, one thing that you can do is you go and you collect solutions. These are samples of 5 different problems that we studied in one of the first papers that we wrote about this thing. And by looking at the rainbow plot, we visited what we call the PCA doctor. And you go to the PCA doctor and she will tell you if the singular values of your manifold are decaying exponentially, then you're good to go. That means that you can chop at a very small number of bases and you will get a very good approximation to your problem. If they're not decaying exponentially, which is kind of the case for this problem in where the solution just moves left and right, then no, a linear embedding will not work. Don't even bother in making the Galerkin equations because this will not be a good emulator for your problem. You need to be more creative and do something else. So visit the PCA doctor, she will help you. There is a lot of resources out there to understand and to get used to how to apply the reduced basis method for problems in general. And we have written a specific one on how to do this for quantum problems with the aim of nuclear physics. And we have a Jupyter notebook that you can take a look. It has many sections. It has text, it has code, it has graphics. It has been made by a very big group of people, including a very awesome high schooler that has worked with us. And the next person might be you. If you're interested in contributing to this, there is many sections that still will be nice to write. So contact me and I will be happy to guide you on how to contribute to that. So once you have all of those ideas clear, how do you turn this into something useful, into some actual emulator for an actual problem? So I'm showing as the example that I have been highlighting throughout the talk. Imagine that you have some Schrodinger equations for scattering. You could be thinking of an optical potential to describe how neutrons bounce and get absorbed with imaginary terms on the nucleus. And you have many parameters that control this thing. Now, a grad student, a couple of decades ago, poor grad student wrote a Fortran code to run this thing. It's a black box. It's awful. You don't even want to open that thing. But if you were to open it, you will see that this code is connecting these parameters, solving the Schrodinger equation for all the channels and all of that, and outputting the final observable that you care, which in this case is the differential cross-section or the total cross-section as a function of energy. To obtain that, your black box needs to compute order 5,000 variables, whatever that is for the nucleus that you have. The idea of building a reduced order model is to say, can I bypass these and build something that has to compute far fewer variables to obtain something that is very approximate? And if you succeed, you're going to obtain a framework that has a much better trade-off between accuracy and speed. It's not that it's perfect accuracy, it's just that as you change the number of bases, for example, the error will decrease much faster without a very big increase in time in comparison to what we call the traditional or the high fidelity methods. That's the main idea. We have applied these to a lot of stuff. Here are some examples. We went for nuclear structure in SCRM and covariant relativistic density functional theory. We have applied it to neutron stars and the equation of state, to beam control for the actual experimental setups, to very expensive calculations that are called auxiliary field diffusion Monte Carlo, for scattering, for time dynamics, a lot of problems. The main takeaway is that we have seen speedups between 100 and 10 million times faster. That means that if something were to take 2 months computing, now you can compute it in a second, which is a lot. It's very nice. So that is the main takeaway on this. So to summarize the reduced basis method, I'm halfway through. I'm not finishing my talk yet. I'm going to now show you what comes after. But if you were to summarize it in a slide, how this entire thing was possible, how I was able to obtain those huge orders of magnitude speedup, is these 2 steps. You find good reduced coordinates for your system, and then you find their dynamics. In the case of the reduced basis, coordinates are the amplitudes of a reduced basis. Dynamics are found by projecting the original operators using the Galerkin projection approach. And if you want to hear me talk for an entire hour on how that works, here's a link to another video. I am full of videos. What if this is a problem, though? What if you're sitting there, you really want to make this work for your problem, you heard the talk, but it is really hard to make the equations by doing the Galerkin projection. And there's many reasons why that could happen. You could have operators that are just not happy about being projected. This is called non-affine or non-linear operators, in where the parametric dependence is intertwined so strongly with the dependence on the coordinate that you cannot recompute these projections to make an efficient emulator. What if linear embedding is not a good thing for your problem? You visited the PCA doctor and she told you, I am so sorry, your problem is not amenable for linear embedding. So you might want to do something else, maybe the solution manifold twist in a very interesting way. So you say, screw it. I'm going to use as my reduced coordinates, not only the amplitudes, but I'm going to, for example, make my functions, my reduced bases expand or contract, or I'm going to make them move. As soon as you do that, that's it. You cannot do the Galerkin projection in a very smart way. Or you just crank the machine learning knob all the way up and you say, I'm going to use an autoencoder, a variational autoencoder to compress my high dimensional objects, obtain a latent space that has a low dimensionality, and then use those as reduced coordinates. What are you going to do to project that? And the third reason is, what if you don't have equations? Maybe you're dealing with an experimental setup and there is no Schrodinger equation that you can project, but you still have a hunch that this will work. These two, which is what I'm going to focus on the rest of the talk, even if you were able to solve this problem, they can increase the development of the emulator by a lot of time. It can cast many hours that you have to spend in solving this. As an example, when we were working with the relativistic mean field equations that Jorge has been working with, if you look at your operators, these are the Klein-Gordon equations for the meson fields that are involved in the thing. Details don't matter. But if you go to Galerkin and you make the Galerkin projection on your thingy, you open the equations that you get, and here is an example. These are the equations for calcium 48. If you open this file, you end up with this thing. This entire block is a bunch of characters equals 0. That is this line in here, and then there is the next equation. If you open this, it's a bunch of nonsense, a bunch of numbers, because equations were nonlinear. So you're reducing your problem, but you end up having massive equations that you have to solve. So even if you can, that doesn't mean that you should. So the idea, the objective of where I want to move forward is to make building this thing easier. I want to use a handful of solutions still. So I'm aiming for a problem in where I can solve the problem 20, 50 times, but not millions. And I want to use underlying knowledge of how the equations that I'm trying to solve actually look like. So this is my objective of this talk. I want to share ways in where you can speed up the making of the emulator. That's why the title is the way that it is. I don't want to speed computations. I want to speed up the process of speeding up computations. So I thought that was funny to use the speeding up operator twice. Okay, so let's see how you can do that. And the first steps that me and my friends have been taking in that direction. Let me give you the same example that we have been playing with so that I don't annoy you with more stuff. Schrodinger equation, scattering. I have a Wood-Saxon potential. I'm varying the strength of that thing. And if I were to actually do the Galerkin projection on this operator, details don't matter. But after you go and you play with it, you end up with an equation that looks like this. You project this into two bases because your space has dimension 2. And you end up with a 2 by 2 matrix that has some numbers and some dependence on the parameter alpha times the two coefficients that you're after. And that is going to be equal to a vector that actually the vector also depends on the parameter alpha. I should have put up alpha here. If you were to open up this matrix, you realize that in this particular case, it has two terms. It has a term that is independent of the parameter, and that is basically the representation of the kinetic operator in the space of the reduced spaces. And it has another term that is proportional to the parameter, and that's a representation of the potential operator in the space of your reduced spaces. These matrix elements are just a contraction of your operators on your reduced spaces. The whole idea is screw that, and instead of obtaining these numbers from projecting the operators, learn them from data. Propose a form for your equations and say, since I can evaluate my high fidelity solution 50 times, that's more than enough to set it up on these 8 numbers that I need to figure out. So you cast it into a machine learning regression problem, and you learn these numbers to reproduce the dynamics of the coefficients that you want to obtain. Ideally, the equations that you're going to cast are going to be implicit equations relating the parameters and the coefficients. And I have an entire speech on why that is the case. That is a very good question to ask me at the end if you want. Why implicit equations should be the way to go. Now, I am not inventing this, even though I thought I was some years ago, but then I started reading, and this is something that has existed for a long time in the literature of reduced order models. It's basically, can I use a data-driven approach to not only derive the reduced coordinates that I want, but also the reduced equations for those coordinates? So I really think we need to go out and read, and this is something that I put together for a presentation that I gave last year. in the last year, I have read a total of 0 of these papers that I'm saying that we should read because I'm very busy, as everybody. But I really keep saying we really should find time to read. I want to highlight other similar approaches that people are doing. This is a novel approach. It's called parametric matrix models, and it's done by people here at the lab. And they have the inspiration is very similar to many of these approaches, but they have extended this method way beyond the idea of emulators and reduced order models and learning the equations for the coefficients into a complete new machine learning method, and it's working extremely well. So I suggest the paper is published in Nature. I suggest that you go and take a look. It's very, very interesting work. Okay, let me show you the example plots that I have for what we were discussing with the scattering example. Next plots that I'm going to show were heavily assisted on making them by ChatGPT, and I am more than happy to share the notebooks later. So basically, I have my Wood-Saxon potential, and I say I'm going to be varying the depth of the Wood-Saxon. Here's my rainbow plot, just in a different color palette of my wave function, of my snapshots. I make my reduced basis. I visit the PCA doctor. She tells me that I'm good to go. So I look at how the coefficients of the reduced basis change when I change the strength of the Wood-Saxon potential. We have discussed this already. So I'm tracing this manifold. Now, I am going to try to learn these coefficients in 3 different ways. The first one is by cheating. I'm going to actually solve the high fidelity solution, and I'm going to ask myself what are the optimal coefficients that I could have used for my reduced basis to reproduce the function that I'm obtaining. So that is, if you made an emulator in this way, it's terrible because it's an emulator that needs a high fidelity solution to give you a good approximation to the solution. But it's just for training purposes. The second way is a Galerkin full projection, the way that we have done it so far. And the third way is exactly what I'm proposing. I'm going to try to learn these matrices and this vector that depend on the parameter out of my data, and then I'm going to move from there. And here are the results, the first part of the results. What you see is that in color, I have the optimal solutions by the first approach. In black, I have the Galerkin projection solution that you will get for this system. And in red, I have what you obtain from learning them in this way that I described. And the learning thing is much, much better than Galerkin in this way. It's not super surprising because I was training it exactly to learn these coefficients to minimize the L2 norm. The Galerkin projection minimizes something different that is called the energy norm. So, okay, good. But the thing is that it works. And if you look at the difference in the wave function, this third approach seems to reproduce the wave function much, much better. Again, it has to do with the L2 norm. So if you make a plot of the residual that you're getting for this specific case, this approach is much, much better. If you increase the number of bases instead of 2 to 4, you end up observing a similar behavior. It's just that now, interestingly, Galerkin is able to project the first 2 coefficients much better than before, which is an interesting observation. It seems that whenever you increase your basis size, not only you're helping on the linear embedding part, but you're obtaining dynamical equations that are better to describe what is happening. I also have reasons why that is true, but I am looking at the time and I'm starting to get worried, so I'm going to continue. You can ask me that question later. So the thing works. It works very well. Now everybody is on top of the wave function. One interesting thing that you might ask is this learning procedure overfitting? Are you learning true equations that in some way represent what is happening underlying in the actual equations? And the answer is yes, at least for this case. I can extrapolate very well. If I train my method only in a window of the parameter that I'm changing and I extrapolate, both of them work very well. So very cool, but what is the use of this? I already knew how to build an emulator for varying an affine parameter. What if now we say I am going to vary the radius of my interaction? That is non-affine, so the Galerkin projection will not work. I try the same thing. The solution lives in a low dimensional space, and the key punchline is it works. You write down equations, inspire on what you think you might have obtained if you have done a Galerkin projection, which you're not doing because you cannot, and you fit the coefficients, and the thing works like a charm and it extrapolates very well. This means that we have a working emulator without the need of a hyper-reduction technique that is called the empirical interpolation method. Details don't matter. If you have never heard these words in your life, ignore this. If you have thought about this is an extremely important finding. I can build these type of things without the need of twisting my mind on thinking how the heck I'm going to approximate the operators in an affine way. Where do I want to go with this? Because if you look at the flowchart, this is a lot of information as well. This is from the Rose paper, the reduced order scattering emulator that we built. Super complicated paper. And a big part of the complication is because we had to use the empirical interpolation method. That is this whole thing in here so that we were able to make the projection. If instead you use what I'm suggesting, you get rid of all the things that are with the x's, and instead of making these matrix elements out of projection, pain, and sweat, you make them out of data. It's much easier. Will be very nice. I wish that I have thought of this when we were writing that code. So where do I want to go with this? Do I want to go and rewrite the entire code and the entire paper that we had in rows? Not really. That already works and is very nice. I want to think bigger into the future, and I want to talk with you about pipelines, and that's what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes. For that, I'm going to give another example of something else because it's the first placing where I feel that I have actually, with the people that I'm working on this, embraced this idea of finding reduced coordinates, finding equations inspired by the underlying equations. This is a project. We're finishing the paper. We should be able to make it public very soon on emulating the QRPA calculations that are used for many things, including calculating beta decays and strength functions, and other observables like the dipole polarizability when you annoy a nucleus and you see how it vibrates. In here, I'm showing you the different strength functions that shows you how the nucleus is going to behave for different perturbations at different energies or frequencies. And you see that it's a rainbow plot. We're changing the parameters, the underlying parameters of your model. This looks beautiful, but awful. If you try to model this with a reduced basis, you're going to need a reduced basis of order 30 or 40. And even if you do, making the projection equations on this thing was a mess. I spent a lot of time with Lauren Jean and Ante Ravlik thinking how we're going to build an emulator for this stuff. So at the end, we settled up with everything that I have been sharing with you, which is a data-driven approach to stuff. And here's a diagram on how the thing works. The first thing that we realized was useful to do is make a diagram on how the full order model make its calculation. And the way it works is you have the EDF parameters. Alpha comes in here. You have the high fidelity solver that solves the HFE equations, basically that tells you how your nucleus looks like in its ground state for this parameter set. And then that information is set up in this matrix that I have no idea how to call it, but it's a matrix that is a very big matrix that then you have to solve to obtain the eigenvalues and the eigenvectors on that thing. And this matrix is order 100,000 by 100,000. Once you have obtained the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of this matrix, you build the strength function as a linear superposition of very tiny Lorentzians, but 100,000 of those tiny Lorentzians. And once you have that, once you have the strength function, you go forth and you calculate your observables. In this case, the dipole polarizability or the half-life for beta decay. Cool, lots of computation. What can we do? Well, if you see this big N, you might be tempted to say, what if I just replace big N by small n? At the end of the day, that's what we have been doing so far. So you go and you make a chart, you don't think, you copy-paste the exact same thing, and everywhere that you see a big N, you replace it by a small n. And small n might be 10, 12, 8. So the idea is that now I'm going to try to reproduce a strength function instead of a superposition of 100,000 peaks, maybe 3 or 5 or 10. But eventually you run into the problem that where are your dynamical equations? These are good reduced coordinates for your objects, fewer Lorentzians, but where are they coming from? So you write down an equation that you think somehow relates to the original underlying equations and you feed it from data. It has some parametric dependence that you came up with in a creative way. You solve this system, you go through it, you train it, and you're done. And it works. And this is a plot showing how it works. So in the middle plot is the two parameters that we were varying in this problem. You see this x in here. When I hit play, this x is going to start moving up. I'm exploring the parameter space for this model. I already forgot what these two parameters are, but I think Ante is in the call and he could answer. But this thing is moving in that direction. The black rectangle is the inside region where we train the emulator, so everything that is outside is extrapolating. And on the top, I'm showing the strength function, the original strength function, and the one that we obtained by using this emulator with this parametric matrix model, inspired by the data. So I'm going to hit play, and you see how the X starts moving, and on top, the original and the emulated version, they're very similar to each other. And I'm reproducing this object that needs 100,000 numbers by a superposition of 10 or so numbers. That's the whole idea. We nail the reduced coordinates, and then we nail a good set of reduced of reduce equations for those coordinates that seem to work very, very well. So the question that now thinking about you and thinking about the needs that your collaboration might have is, can we actually do this for other models beyond the scattering or the strength function calculation? And I just want to share how I think one might approach this problem. The idea will be try to take a look at the original computation framework that you have. This is an object that has a very high dimensional latent space, and it connects parameters with observables. And we're trying to build the reduced order model that does the same thing in a smaller number of latent space variables. So basically, if you were to open this with a magnifying glass, the question is, can you infer a way of finding the reduced coordinates and making the equations? And part of the reason why I say that we should try to look for implicit equations is that if you look at the operators, how the operators change when you change the parameters, usually that change is not that hard. It's not only that it's not that hard, you usually have it, you know it. For example, the Wood-Saxon potential, I know exactly how it changed as I change the parameters. The solution, though, has a complicated dependence on the parameters because, of course, it's passing through a differential equation. So the idea will be get inspired from the equations that you have in here, find the reduced coordinates, fit the representation of the operators as you change the parameters alpha in that operator space, and then invert. And then try to reproduce the high dimensional object that comes on the other side of that. This is easier said than done. And I took this example from a recent paper from Yukiya, in where they were trying to build an emulator for connecting, for reproducing the abundance pattern. If I want to think of some calculation that tries to calculate the R process, simulate the R process for the abundance pattern that has many parameters, as we were describing, like the data is all the cross sections, the masses, etc. What is a good set of reduced coordinates for that thing? In the intermediate step, when the calculation is halfway through, is there a way to compress that information? Can I find a very small set of numbers that is a latent space that I could track of? No idea. This is a conversation that I would love to have with any of you if you're interested, so that then we can think, once we identify that, what is a good set of implicit equations that I can apply to those coordinates so that I can emulate that in that way. Maybe that is something that ends up being comparable with the accuracy that Yukiya show. Might be worse, might be better, could be interesting to explore. And the final thing that I want to mention before I go to my takeaways, what if we are uninspired? We wake up that day and we are not feeling very creative on coming up with these underlying equations. Well, one thing that you could try is another direction that we have been exploring that I'm happy to share with you, which is to use genetic algorithms or evolutionary algorithms in computer, is a branch of computer science, in where you have an algorithm, a machine learning algorithm that is able to learn equations from data, and you don't have to pre-think how the form of the equations should look like. And this, I'm just highlighting the paper that we have on the archive, where we apply this with a group of friends to the emulating the densities, not the wave functions, but the densities of Scherm and relativistic mean field. The idea was, we visited the PCA doctor. She told us that we are good to go with a reduced set of coordinates for the densities, but I have no idea how these coefficients are going to change with the parameters. So we learn that dynamical equation without previous knowledge on how the actual operators were looking like by using this genetic approach that search over a span of many, evolve them together until we end up with equations that reproduce very well how the coefficients of the reduced spaces for the densities are changing with respect to the two parameters, which is L and J. Now, we got this expression for the equation. I still need to look at it for a long time to get more physics intuition on why these terms appear. But I think that even though I don't have that yet for this is a step that can help me discover equations that eventually will be interpretable and will tell me, of course, new physics or new ways of interpreting the underlying physics. So with this, I think that not only we're going to be able to go from my high fidelity butter to the I cannot believe it's not butter, but it could open the door for model discovery, where you end up creating new things that you didn't know you could have made, instead of only focusing on copying the same model that you had, but making it faster. And this is a direction that I am particularly excited to explore. So that takes me to the end of my talk. I have two takeaways, two-ish. The first one is about dimensionality reduction. in general for nuclear physics. I want to highlight the speedups. That has been great, game changer with respect to many applications, and it's two clear steps. Find good reduced coordinates for your system, find good reduced equations for those coordinates. And by changing these things, you're allowed to be creative, mix, match, and read. We need to read. There is a lot of stuff out there, not done by us, but done by non-nuclear physics people that will be very helpful for what we want to. And I highlighted a lot on how you can find these dynamical equations from data, where data in this case is model evaluations, and ideally implicit equations instead of explicit ones. And my second takeaway is about machine learning and statistics in general. I believe, the same as many other folks, that these things are propelling nuclear physics towards a new era of discovery. But I also think that they could help propel us to an era of workforce excellence, in where we lower the barriers of entry for more people to join us and be able to meaningfully contribute to this. And I have many reasons why I believe that, and that could also be a good question for later. But the main takeaway on that is that there's so many resources out there, and these skills are so transferable that a lot of the young generation that is joining us is eager to learn them. And sometimes they already come knowing that. You know the nuclear physics, they know that. You can combine them and make very good projects that makes everybody thrive. So with that, I want to thank a lot of people, the folks that pay for my lunch and my collaborations, the core team that have made many of these things with me, the rest of the team that is also super important. I am sure that I'm forgetting a lot of people in this list. I give you some further resources, including the link to this talk, and I thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Pablo. Yeah, that's a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things. You talk about a lot of different things, and I do think that we need a lot of time to digest your talk. So
Yeah,
it's good that we record it.
yeah, but of
Okay,
course.
everyone. So do we have any questions for Pablo? Oh, Claudia, please.
Hi, thanks for
Hi.
this very nice talk. I really enjoyed it. And
Thank
I
you.
was wondering about the last part.
Uh-huh.
You say that you can, if you don't know the equations that would go into your emulator, you can use some algorithm to that can learn them and figure them out. I
Mhm.
was wondering, what's the accuracy of that compared to actually knowing the equations, and does it make the whole process slower when you have to train this algorithm through the data to recognize this?
Thank you. Very good question. First, I'm not an expert on this part. The other friends that are listed here are, but I do have some observations that I can share. When we did this emulator and we check the accuracy on where we were reproducing the densities as a function of the parameters, the equations that we got from the genetic approach were basically touching the performance that you will get if you cheat, if you just fit those coefficients from the actual high fidelity evaluations. That tells you that if you want to improve the performance of the emulator, you don't need better equations, you need bigger bases. So on that specific case, I think that the complexity of equations that we got were more than enough to get us the accuracy, the best possible accuracy for that problem. In that paper, we have a pedagogical example in where I don't remember exactly the physics problem, but it's something that is not nuclear physics. It's related to how the flux of light changes, the power radiated changes as a function of the distance. And we illustrated how that has a specific equation. It's a very simple equation, the 1 over r squared times 4 pi, yada, yada, yada. And we show how the genetic procedure is able to find the equation. And when there is a equation relating the input to the output, in many cases, is able to find the exact equation that was connecting them. So that has been my experience so far. I hope that that helps with your question.
Thanks. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the question. More questions?
Yeah, so I have a question for that QRPA emulator. Um, could you please tell me how exactly that you are going to reduce this QRPA matrix? Do you okay, so I guess what I'm wondering is that if you want to build a reliable smaller QRPA matrix, before that, do you still need to exactly solve for that big QRP matrix for several times or many times to figure out how to build that smaller one?
Yep. It's a fully data-driven approach. How many times though? Is not that many. So if you were making an emulator that is like a neural network, that is more black box type, connecting input to output, I will argue that you will need a lot of evaluations to train that thing. In this case, I think I estimated, I did a back of the envelope calculation, I needed around 10 full calculations to fit the parameters that I have for many reasons. But the way that the idea is that once you committed yourself to a series of reduced coordinates, you look at the strength function and you say, I really think that I can approximate this thing with three. Let's say that you say that. Three Lorentzians should be more than enough for my needs. Then you need to make this smaller QRPA matrix. Is this really a smaller QRPA matrix? I don't think so. I think this is a matrix that is inspired. It has some resemblance to the QRPA matrix, but it's something else because everything has been twisted. You have changed the meaning of what your coordinates are. So you have to build it. And the way that we did it is we run the full code n times. I think Ante run 200 and something calculations in total. And you obtain you fit these coefficients based on those calculations, and then you extrapolate. And I think there is a plot on the paper. I don't have it here, but there is a plot on the paper in where he shows how much the accuracy decreases of the emulator as you decrease the amount of data that you're giving it to train. And the trade-off is not very steep. Is you can get away with very few data points and still have something that is very accurate to extrapolate, which is very important because each one of these calculations, and I don't know if you're in the call, but you can say how long each one of these takes. We usually joke that he's out there chopping trees to feed to the high performance computing cluster to make these things. Does that
I
make sense?
see. Yes, it will help, and I'm sure that I will read this paper after you guys publish it.
Yeah. I will definitely share it.
Okay, thank you, Pablo.